option of captions from my from Google. So I just want you to know that they're not perfect, but I want to make sure that we're doing our best to ensure that these are accessible and that we can make sure everyone can follow along with the materials. So my name is Janet, and I just want to introduce myself to you. I am an educator, and I am also a community activist. I like to call myself a literacy activist. I work with families and community members to do anti-racist, anti-bias trainings for educators and staff in schools. I've taught for 22 years. I've been both a history teacher, a literacy interventionist, as well as a librarian. And so I'm very passionate about this work and about ensuring that we do a lot to resource our children early and often to ensure they're able to be in a relationship and in community with people from many different backgrounds. So tonight I'm going to ground us, and my greeting to you is Sawubona. Sawubona is a Zulu greeting that translates to I see you, but this embodies a deeper level of knowing. It means that all of my attention is with you, that I see you and I allow myself to be seen. And that sharing our needs, our fears, our mistakes, and accepting them as a part of who you are, but not the sum of who you are. This means that I accept you as you are and that you are a part of me. In response to this is to reply with Shikoba. And Shikoba means that I am grateful to be seen by you. I am grateful to come into existence for you. And that's really powerful because until we are able to embrace that kind of sharing, we don't truly exist for one another in the ways that we can. So this is about reciprocity of a relationship. And so the work we do tonight will help our children to be able to be in this kind of relationship with people in community. So when we think about our goals today, we want to just ground ourselves in some research around belonging and around othering and inclusivity when we talk about race, but also deepening our understanding through community dialogue. So the discussion and the breakout sessions that will happen after the main portion of the presentation will allow us to do some co-creation in community. So just some norms. I want to show you this kind of graphic that talks about, we also want to stay in kind of our learning zone. We want to move out of our comfort zone. So we want to stretch ourselves, but we also want to avoid kind of this panic zone, which might come about when you have expressed and shared something very personal or makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So we want to make sure that you're staying in a learning zone where you can be present and curious, but also avoiding being in that comfort zone where you're kind of sticking with what you know. So we want to also tonight honor that we're speaking from our own experience, that we're experts of our own lived experience. And so instead of doing generalizations, we'll stick to using the I instead of they and we and you. And so the goal also is that tonight, our goal is not to come to consensus. Our goal is to come to deeper understanding. And that these are topics and questions that we can wrestle with for quite a long time, but the more we're able to practice mindful speaking and listening and be able to engage with one another, then we'll deepen our understanding. We also want to practice the Vegas rule, and that we want to share what you've learned, but we want to hold this space as a non-attribution space. So we want to make sure that if someone tells a story of, their child exploring their racial identity and some of the things their child said, that you won't go back and say, Janet's daughter, let me tell you what happened in the session we had. We want to maintain that we want to learn from one another, but we also want to hold some space as a learning space that will practice and shelter. All right, so we're going to get into our discussion first about bias and babies. So in your mind, I want you to think of the answer for yourself to this question. Are babies born with bias, or do we make them biased? So I'll just pause, and maybe on a slip of paper or just in your mind, think about your answer to that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the research. Researchers from Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and China all show that 6 to 9 month olds demonstrate a bias in favor of members of their own race and racial bias against those of other races. And so in a University of Toronto study, infants as young as 6 months old showed a preference for members of their own race and for their facial features, as well as the languages that their parents and families spoke. There's this phenomenal book that I highly recommend called Together by Dr. Murthy. And Dr. Murthy was the Surgeon General of the United States in the 19th century. And the book is called The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And in this book, he talks about we as human beings are a very social species. We love and we are meant to be in relationship and in community with one another. And we form a myriad of kinds of relationships, from dyads to families, to book clubs. We build and pull together. But we also have research has shown that we've developed evolutionary changes to our neural, hormonal, cellular, genetic mechanisms to support these kinds of relationships and the need to belong. But through that process of evolution, we also develop something very unique around how we have who is trustworthy, who is a member of your in-group. And so in-group, out-group bias is something that is part of a very old part of human development. And so we're going to look at some snippets of some research that has been done. The university, Yale University's Infant Cognition Center is known as the Baby Lab. And they have done some amazing research studies. I'm going to show you just a couple of little clips from this scene. So hopefully the audio, just prepare yourself in case you need to turn it up or down. We're going to look at one scene. Okay, so the first scene we're going to look at is a little bit of a study that they've done, a research study that they've done with babies.
And as part of a new wave of researchers who have discovered seemingly simple ways to probe what's really going on in those adorable little heads. Up goes the curtain. We watched as Wynn and her team asked a question that 20 years ago might have gotten her laughed out of her field. Does Wesley here, at the ripe old age of 5 months, know the difference between right and wrong? Wesley watches as the puppet in the center struggles to open up a box with a toy inside. The puppy in the yellow shirt comes over and lends a hand. Then the scene repeats itself, but this time the puppy in the blue shirt comes and slams the box shut. Nice behavior? Mean behavior, at least to our eyes. But is that how a 5-month-old sees it? Does he have a preference?
Wesley, do you remember these guys from the show?
To find out, a researcher who doesn't know which puppet was nice and which was mean offers Wesley a choice.
Who do you like?
He can't answer, but he can reach.
That one.
Wesley chose the good guy, and he wasn't alone.
That one.
More than 3/4 of the babies tested reached for the nice puppet.
That one.
Wynn tried it out on even younger babies, 3-month-olds, who can't control their arms enough to reach, but they can vote with their eyes, since research has shown that even very young babies look longer at things they like.
Which one do you like?
Daisy here looked at the mean puppet for 5 seconds, then switched to the nice one for 33.
All right. So one of the things that we can see is that there is some indication that babies are aware of kind of good and bad actions, right? And that maybe evolutionary wise, that this is something that helps in survival. Who is nice, who is kind, who is trustworthy? All right, we're gonna look at one other clip. And this second clip, we wanna see a little bit more around, so in this one, I'm going to take a look at what happens when babies share something with
similarities.
similarities.
So Nate, who chose Cheerios over graham crackers. The origins of Wynn is probing something big, the origins of bias, the tendency to prefer others who are similar to ourselves.
Adults will like others who share even really absolutely trivial similarities with them.
So will Nate, who chose Cheerios over graham crackers,
Hi.
prefer this orange cat who also likes Cheerios over this gray cat who likes graham crackers instead.
Which one do you like?
Apparently so.
None of these guys?
But if babies have positive feelings for the similar puppet, do they actually have negative feelings for the one who's different? To find out, Wynn showed babies the gray cat, one who liked the opposite food, struggling to open up the box to get a toy. Will Gregory want to see the graham cracker eater treated well? Or does he want him treated badly?
Which one do you like? That one. Okay.
Gregory seemed to want the different puppet treated badly. So he went with his bias in a way. And so did Nate.
That one?
And 87% of the other babies tested. From this, Wynn concludes that infants prefer those who harm others who are unlike them.
What could be more arbitrary than whether you like graham crackers or Cheerios?
So what we're seeing in some of this research is that children in preschool and kindergarten already begin to attribute positive traits to their own groups, their in-groups, groups that are similar to them, over out-groups. Whether that's based on race or gender or even random things like t-shirt assignments, children learn to think their own groups are nicer, smarter, and friendlier than others. And when we look at this research, there's another book, Paul Bloom, the author of Just Babies, The Origins of Good and Evil, that say that we are looking at biologically and reinforced by our social environment, that babies, before they can even speak or walk, like social scientists, they are studying us and they are observing who is in their circle, who are they surrounded with, who are their caregivers, and that is how they are determining who is part of their in-group. Dr. Con Lee, who is the professor of moral development and developmental neuroscience at the University of Toronto, is a lead author of a study. And what he says is these findings point to the possibility that racial bias arises out of our lack of exposure to other race individuals in infancy, and that if we can pinpoint the starting place of racial bias, we can maybe start to find ways to prevent racial biases from even happening. And this is critically important now more than ever. We are in the midst of a change in the US population. Children of color will account for a majority of the nation's 74 million children. And this is happening already in parts of our country. So here, if you look at the map, in places like Florida and Alabama and Texas and Arizona, children of color already account for more than 50% of the majority of those states. And so our children are going to be colleagues and working for and working with and collaborating with people from many diverse backgrounds. And will they be able to go into those relationships feeling kinship and feeling connected to those groups, or are they going to still be relying on this in-group, out-group bias that kind of plagues folks? And the other really important thing to understand about this is that what we know about implicit bias and in-group, out-group association is that it impacts the hearts and minds of children. In this area of relational neurophysiology, this looks at how social exclusion impacts the brain. And so this theory around social pain overlap confirms that the pain we feel from social exclusion and pain from physical injury and illness, they share the same brain pathways that register distress. And so when kids say that, when kids have been ridiculed or maybe targeted at school or just made to feel like they're not part of a group, if they have like physical symptoms, they may say, my stomach hurts when I think about going to school, when they think about being in some of the places where they might be experiencing othering and isolation, they might have these physical kinds of feelings of pain. And when we know and correlate that with research that shows that, 40% of African Americans have high blood pressure. And a newly published study in the Journal of American Heart Association suggests that high levels of chronic stress from experiences like racial bias and othering is actually contributing to this weathering of the body. So, we also want to mitigate harm and do less daily damage to the people in our community. So let's talk about disrupting bias. And so when we look at talking to kids about race, and this is great research from the childrenscommunityschool.org. They have a social justice resource. And so when we think about birth to one, that babies have this 3 months, they look more closely at faces that match their caregivers. And that at 2 years old, children as young as 2 use race to reason about people's behaviors. At 2 to 5 years old, that children use race to choose their playmates. And at 4 to 5, that racial prejudice in the early preschool years kind of begins to peak. Who they want to be friends with, who they want to play with, who they don't like, why they don't like them. At 5 years old, Black and Latinx children in research settings show no preference towards their own groups as compared to white children at this age, who are more likely to be strongly biased in favor of whiteness. And 5 years old, kindergarten, many show the same racial attitudes held by adults in our culture. They've already learned to associate groups with higher status than others. And so at 5 to 7, explicit conversations about interracial friendships can dramatically improve things. But in some research that I didn't include in here just because it is kind of lengthy, but Sesame Street did an amazing research project with parents, like thousands of parents and teachers and caregivers, to ask, are you talking about race with children? And the parents, more than 57% of them are not. Teachers, 70% are not. And so no one's really leaning in to explicitly do this work. And so kids are navigating this on their own, and they're absorbing the messages from our society, and that, we're not equipping them in the ways that which they deserve. So I'm going to turn here towards some strategies of things we can do. One is the power of diverse stories and the power of including diverse books. And this allows children to do some work where they see our shared humanity. So what we would leverage in this time is actually leveraging for children that who is a part of their in-group, and how do we expand that through stories? How do we expand students being able and children being able to connect with characters that are different colors than them, different gender expressions than them, different, and they see the difference and do the bridging around what is the power of the story to connect them to characters. Using stories to highlight champions of justice and equality. So saying, this is how we stand up for things. This is what happened in our historical past, but how somebody made a difference. Using stories to develop that critical thinking and to build the vocabulary around peace and freedom and justice and injustice. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. One is, I, as an educator, will say that dinosaurs are like a pivotal joy for kids at some point in time, usually. Not always, but what I think is powerful is asking your child what topics and subjects they are already interested in, and then as a parent or caregiver or educator, seeking out diverse experts of that topic, that books that celebrate that. So one of the things I like to do is reading some stories that the intersectionality of showing women who are scientists and children who are different colors who share this interest in this topic, and then an expert, and sharing a little bit about that expert's journey and their growing up. And so what's nice, there's a video linked here, but I think our time will kind of limit me from showing it. But she talks about growing up and what made her interested in dinosaurs. And so letting children see a little bit about how a person's path was how they were set up to be both a scientist or a researcher. Another example of using that is sharks. So animals are always a big draw for kids, right? And so being able to connect books like Shark Lady, which I love, about Dr. Eugenie Clark, who studied sharks and loved sharks and got her PhD in this work and taught, and it was her passion. But, she was also a biracial woman. She was Asian and white. And so when you see the video clips of her, she has her mother in her traditional dress. And so even to read this story and talk about what are some stereotypes that we people have about sharks. So sometimes we can even use some of this language and also talk to the children using animals, using different kinds of ways to bring that language into their forethought. So when we talk about what are ways that sharks might be kind of displayed in popular culture as, being completely violent or what have you, and is that true after they do some research? And then as you developmentally go forward, being able to see them use that language about other things. Another thing that's really powerful that we do in my work is that we have a Black Dad Storytime and Book Club. And so in this event, we uplift and center communities that have been underserved and underrepresented. And so what's been so beautiful about this series is that each dad picked a book that really meant something to them. And so this dad, Brian, talked about hair love because he has 2 daughters and he loves to do their hair and he loves to get them ready for school and he really wants to be good at it. And then we have Wayne, who just had a little baby. And so when we do the Zoom calls and anyone is welcome to come, we have usually, our last one, we had probably, 57 folks on the call, each with, each family with children. And then we had a whole Boys and Girls Club. And so in that experience, just hearing a father talk about why reading is so important and why his baby just brings him so much joy. We also have cooking nights where fathers talk about the foods and growing foods and doing gardening. So all of these things help to disrupt on multiple levels some of the stereotypes that children may be developing around people from different backgrounds and different groups. I'm going to give us this quote, and then we're going to pause to do a little talk back and chat back before we get into some of our groups, but I want to give us some processing time. I find this quote to be incredibly powerful from Bell Hooks, that committed acts of caring let all students know that the purpose of education is not to dominate or prepare them to be dominators, but rather to create the conditions for freedom. Caring educators open the mind, allowing students to embrace a world of knowing that is always subject to change and challenge. And so as parents and caregivers, we are those educators for our children. And the more that we are preparing them to be in relationship in sawubona with people from many backgrounds and many cultures, we're disrupting and ending cycles that have kept people apart and separated. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And I see I want us to have a moment to just pause, and I want to offer a time is there some questions about some of the content that was shared before we get ready to do some conversations around how we're approaching these topics with our young